I'd like you to put into the chat your opinion or judgment about whether or not the benefits of job creation from a project. Let's suppose an agricultural project is created and it's judged that it will generate a number of jobs. Should we include those created jobs in the benefit cost analysis? Okay, so there's a reasonable level of agreement there. There's a fair number of people have said no, and then a fair number of people have said maybe a bit, depending on whether the people who got the jobs were previously unemployed. Sometimes you might be able to tell whether they were unemployed, but often my guess would be you couldn't really know that very well. You might be lucky and be able to tell that. Maybe you've got a project that is specifically targeted at employing unemployed people, fair enough. But if it's just sort of anonymous people from the job market being put in a job, you wouldn't really know that. Sam Miller says, I don't like including jobs, but if it can be demonstrated that there is unemployment or underemployment, then there can be an argument to be made to include it. Okay, so let me make a few comments. And there was various comments pretty similar to that. People liked Talia's comment. Let me find my, all right. Okay, we all know politicians like having jobs in there. So there's a couple of simplistic approaches. We could just whack in salaries paid as a benefit, but a couple of problems there. There could be full employment, and creating a new job is likely to displace another job. Or another problem with that is that even if there's not full employment, an unemployed person is probably not completely idle. They may be caring for others. They may be doing voluntary work. And so that's not valueless activity. And if you just ignore that, then you're probably overestimating the benefits of job creation. Simplistic approach number 2, which is more common, is just to assume that a new job has zero value. And there are some guidelines that say that's what we should do. So Commonwealth of Australia, 2006, this is I think, as far as I'm aware, this is still the most recent guidelines from the Australian government. To say that a project will create 100 jobs is not to say that a project will reduce unemployment by 100 people. Well, that's definitely true. As a general rule, it is recommended that analysts assume that labour, as with other resources, is fully employed. Moreover, unless the project is specifically targeted towards the goal of reducing unemployment, it can be expected that many of the jobs will be filled by individuals who are currently employed, but who are attracted either by the pay or by other attributes of the new positions. So the position in that guideline and in some others is to adopt a starting position of no, zero value. I don't know about you, but that's made life difficult for me at times, trying to explain why I'm not going to give any weight to job creation to people whose BCA I'm doing for them. Oops, go down. So I was interested. But there's some problems with that, isn't there? There's problems because, I mean, we would all have an intuitive sense that even temporary unemployment is costly to individuals, both financially and potentially, depending on the individual, psychologically. And so is there a spot in between those extremes that we could identify and think about how to go there? What realistic, point in between those extremes might be justifiable and defensible? And so if you're interested in jobs, I recommend having a look at the literature by this guy, Bartik, who's probably done more on it than anyone else, or at least more than I've read than anyone else. He's looked at job losses specifically in the context of environmental regulation in the US. So Maxim asked about what about job losses? Well, that is the context for Bartik. And so he's responding to the observation that regulation increases business costs and that can reduce employment, but observing that could be offset to some extent by increased job gains due to increased demand for pollution control equipment and services. So even there, it's not a one-way street. And in one of his papers, he concluded that the gains roughly cancel out the losses. So that's a sort of a further sort of reinforcement of the Australian government position. But it does result in a lot of reallocation of jobs. And in one study, he found that the Clean Air Act amendments in the US resulted in the reallocation of about 150,000 jobs. So that, to me, that sounds pretty big. If it's affecting people in a negative way at all from those reallocations, that doesn't seem totally trivial to me. So here he says, if there's involuntary unemployment, there'll be some social cost due to lost wages minus the value of additional non-work time, which I sort of touched on. But the value of non-work time must be adjusted down, as being unemployed has negative effects on most people's well-being. That makes sense. And it can reduce the workers' physical and mental health and their long-run job skills and earnings. So that's all seems pretty sensible to me. He also observes that there can be spillover effects from unemployment. It can affect the unemployed person's family, can be sort of flow-on effects to them, or their partner, or that can affect the children's short-run academic achievement and long-run earnings. I don't know by how much. And he thinks that the social loss from being unemployed might exceed their earnings loss, which is interesting, an interesting observation. And then there's also a loss of tax revenue, but of course we would look upon that as a transfer. So then he looks at some empirical evidence for the US, really tries to dig into this, and finds that in the short term that there's about a 0.5 to 0.75 loss of jobs. About 0.5 to 0.75 of each lost job is replaced in the short term, which is within 5 years or less than 5 years. In 5 years, he found that on average, it's fully replaced. So there's still some cost for what's going on in that less than 5 year period, but in the end, the loss is, there is no loss of employment in at least in his study. He found that a 1% job growth shock reduces the short-run unemployment by 0.5%, and the effect of that is zero within 10 years. Of course, also, if local unemployment is higher, then changes in job growth have a greater effect on unemployment. And he actually has some numbers. So this is the sort of numbers that come out of his detailed analysis, which I'm really just skating the surface on. If you're interested in this, you would have to go back and look at his original studies. But this gives you a sense of the magnitude of what he's finding. He says that at median unemployment rate, the total value of job loss or gain ranges from about 13 to 17% of the earnings lost by being unemployed. So it's a small percentage, right? But it's not nothing. If there's relatively high unemployment, so 10% unemployment, then of course the losses are higher, right? 20 to 25%. And if there's low unemployment, 4 to, 9%, then they're lower, 10 to 14%. But they're still not trivial, right? They're not non-existent. And depending on how big the change in employment is, it might be worth worrying about these sorts of numbers. He's also estimated that the value of job reallocation, even if there is no net change in unemployment, allowing for that transition phase when you're unemployed and feeling bad about yourself and losing money, was 5 to 6%. So again, not nothing, but not huge either. So it's a judgment call whether the number of jobs involved is sufficient to need to worry about these sorts of numbers. Okay, so I will leave that. I think that's enough about that issue.